As every remarkable story comes to an end, one final question remains. Who was Michael Jackson when the cameras stopped rolling? For decades, the world tried to answer that question through headlines, television specials, and endless speculation. Every decision he made as a parent was examined from every possible angle. His children's appearance, the masks they wore, and even their identities became subjects of worldwide debate. But while millions of people believed they knew Michael Jackson through the media, only three people truly experienced him as a father: Prince, Paris, and Biggie. Their memories tell a very different story. They don't remember a global superstar walking onto sold-out stages. They remember a father reading bedtime stories before they went to sleep. They remember movie nights, family vacations, and afternoons spent laughing together at home. They remember a man who encouraged curiosity, celebrated imagination, and reminded them that kindness mattered more than fame. To the public, Michael Jackson was an icon. To his children, he was simply dad. As the years passed, each of them found the courage to speak about the private moments that cameras never captured. Prince often described his father as someone who wanted his children to appreciate the world beyond celebrity. He encouraged them to meet people from different backgrounds, to travel, to learn, and to understand that compassion was one of life's greatest strengths. Paris shared similar memories. She recalled a father who supported her creativity and allowed her to express herself without fear of judgment. He encouraged her to think independently, to ask questions, and to become the person she wanted to be, not the person others expected. Biggie chose a quieter path, speaking less often than his siblings, but when he has appeared publicly, he has reflected the same values his father worked so hard to teach: humility, respect, privacy, and gratitude. Together, the three siblings have become living examples of the lessons Michael hoped would guide them throughout life. Perhaps that is why the old rumors have gradually begun to lose their power. For years, public conversations focused on appearances: who looked like whom, who resembled their father, who their biological parents might have been. But as Prince, Paris, and Biggie matured, those questions slowly became less important, because fatherhood is not measured by headlines, it isn't measured by gossip, and it certainly isn't measured by public opinion. Fatherhood is measured by presence, by guidance, by sacrifice, by the memories shared between parent and child. Regardless of what stories circulated for decades, Michael Jackson raised those children. He protected them, he educated them, he comforted them. And according to all three of them, he loved them unconditionally. In the end, that is the relationship they remember. Not the speculation, not the controversy, not the endless debates, only the man who was there when they needed him most. As history continues to examine Michael Jackson's life, perspectives have slowly evolved. Researchers have revisited old claims. Journalists have separated documented facts from sensational stories. Fans have looked beyond tabloid headlines and rediscovered the extraordinary artist whose music united people across cultures, languages, and generations. But perhaps his most meaningful legacy isn't found in record sales or world tours. It isn't measured by awards or chart positions. It lives in the values carried forward by his children. Today, Prince continues serving communities through charity and media projects. Paris has built her own identity as a musician, actress, and creative artist. Biggie has chosen a quieter life, focused on education, family, and personal growth. Each of them has honored their father in a different way, not by copying his career, but by living according to the principles he taught them: compassion, integrity, curiosity, generosity. Those qualities cannot be inherited through fame. They are learned through love, and perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. It reminds us that behind every public figure is a private life the world rarely sees. Behind every headline is a family living with the consequences of public attention, and behind every legend is a human being whose most important role may never have taken place on a stage. Michael Jackson will always be remembered as one of the greatest entertainers in history. His music changed popular culture. His performances inspired generations. His creativity redefined what was possible in entertainment. But beyond all of those achievements, he was a father who wanted his children to have the childhood he never had. A childhood filled with love instead of pressure, privacy instead of constant attention, freedom instead of expectation. Perhaps he didn't accomplish that perfectly. No parent does, but he tried. And sometimes a parent's greatest success isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by the people their children become. Looking at Prince, Paris, and Biggie today, many believe that Michael Jackson achieved exactly what mattered most. His children grew into thoughtful, compassionate adults who continue moving forward with dignity while honoring the man they called Dad. And maybe that is the real story behind the masks, not one of mystery, not one of controversy, but one of a father doing everything he could to protect the people he loved most. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to explore more untold stories behind history's most fascinating public figures, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Until next time, thanks for watching. As Thomas Jackson III continued searching for answers, his investigation began moving away from family stories and into the world of historical records. The further he looked, the further back in time the trail seemed to go. Eventually, his research led him to South Carolina. There, buried within centuries-old documents, he encountered a name that had been largely forgotten outside family history. That name was July. At first glance, July appeared only briefly in official records. There were no photographs, no personal letters, no diary entries, no detailed account of his life. Instead, what remained of his existence was scattered across plantation records and legal papers created by other people. Yet those fragments would become the key to solving a mystery that had lasted for generations. The records pointed toward a plantation owned by a wealthy South Carolina landowner named James Joel Richborg. Like many plantation owners of his era, Richborg built his wealth through the labor of enslaved men, women, and children. The surviving records painted a picture of a world where human lives were often reduced to numbers and property inventories. One document stood out above all others: Richborg's will. Created in the early 1800s, the document listed property that would be distributed among family members after his death. But alongside land, livestock, and household possessions appeared something deeply disturbing: human beings. Among those listed was an enslaved man named July. For modern readers, the language of these records can be difficult to comprehend. Individuals were recorded not as family members, workers, or citizens. They were treated as assets, transferred from one owner to another through legal documents, just like any other possession. July's name appeared within that system. After Richborg's death, records suggest that July eventually became associated with members of the Gale family. Over time, this connection would play an important role in shaping the identity of future generations. But at that moment, Thomas Jackson still didn't fully understand what he had discovered. He only knew one thing: July existed, and his life appeared connected to the Jackson family story in a significant way. As additional documents surfaced, a clearer picture began to emerge. According to family accounts preserved over generations, July's mother was an enslaved woman named Rose. Like countless others living under slavery, much of her personal history has been lost. Yet her name survived, and through her son, her legacy survived as well. Family traditions describe July as a respected figure within his community. A healer, someone people sought out for advice and treatment. He reportedly worked as a scout and guide, developing a reputation for knowledge and resourcefulness. In many ways, he represented resilience. Despite living within a system designed to deny freedom, identity, and opportunity, he established a meaningful role within the world around him. Eventually, July formed a relationship with a woman named Gina, because enslaved people were denied many legal rights, including recognized marriage protections. Their relationships often went undocumented, but family memory preserved what official paperwork did not. Together, July and Gina had a son. His name was Israel. That birth would prove enormously important, because through Israel, the family line continued, generation after generation, year after year, until eventually it reached Joe Jackson. And through Joe, it reached Michael Jackson. Yet another curious detail remained hidden within the family's history. As Israel grew older, he became associated with the nickname Nero. Over time, people reportedly referred to him as Jack's son. At first, it may have been nothing more than a casual description, a simple way of identifying someone within a local community. But history often works in unexpected ways. Nicknames become family names, informal labels become permanent identities. As generations passed, that descriptive phrase appears to have evolved into the surname carried by future descendants. The same surname that would eventually become famous around the world: Jackson. It is an extraordinary possibility. One of the most recognizable names in entertainment history may have originated from a forgotten reference to a father whose true identity remained uncertain for centuries, a linguistic clue hidden in plain sight. But while Thomas was uncovering these historical records, a much larger question still remained unanswered. Who was July's father? For generations, the family believed they already knew the answer. The story pointed toward Native American ancestry. That explanation had been accepted for decades, yet none of the records Thomas discovered actually confirmed it. Instead, every new document seemed to raise more questions, and soon, Those questions would lead him away from traditional genealogy and into an entirely different field, modern genetic science, because hidden within DNA was evidence that no historical record could erase, evidence capable of reaching across centuries, evidence that would challenge everything the family believed about its origins. And once the genetic testing began, the truth that emerged would prove even more shocking than the plantation records themselves. For generations, the Jackson family's story rested on memory. Family elders passed down names, stories, and traditions that helped explain where they came from. Like countless families across America, especially those whose ancestors lived through slavery, oral history became a bridge connecting the present to a past that written records often failed to preserve. But by the early 21st century, a new tool had emerged: DNA testing. What once required years of professional research could now begin with a simple saliva sample mailed to a laboratory. For many families, the results confirmed long-held beliefs. For others, they raised entirely new questions. Thomas Jackson III hoped genetics would provide the evidence that historical records could not. After years of searching through archives, wills, estate documents, and family records, he still had no proof supporting the family's belief in Native American ancestry, so he decided to look for answers in his own DNA. At first, the results seemed ordinary. The test revealed information about his broader ancestral background and placed him within a specific paternal genetic lineage known as a haplogroup. For most people, those scientific labels mean very little, but for genealogists, they can be incredibly important. A haplogroup functions almost like a genetic roadmap, helping researchers track paternal ancestry across centuries, and sometimes even thousands of years. Thomas studied the results carefully. He wanted to understand what they revealed about his family's past. And then, something unexpected happened. While researching his genetic markers, he discovered another individual who appeared connected to the exact same paternal line. At first, that might not sound remarkable. Distant genetic matches happen all the time, but one detail immediately stood out. The other person's surname was Richborg. The same Richborg family Thomas had already encountered in historical plantation records, the same family connected to July's life in South Carolina. Suddenly, two completely different investigations were pointing toward the same conclusion. One came from centuries-old documents. The other came from modern genetic science, and both appeared to be leading in the same direction. For Thomas, this wasn't merely an interesting coincidence. It was the moment everything changed, because genetic matches between families are rarely random when they occur along direct paternal lines. Unlike many other forms of DNA, Y-DNA passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, century after century. Small mutations occur over time, but the overall genetic signature remains remarkably stable. That stability allows genealogists to trace paternal ancestry with extraordinary accuracy. If a Jackson descendant and a Richborg descendant shared the same rare Y-DNA markers, there had to be an explanation. The question was simple: how were they connected? As Thomas reviewed everything he had already discovered, a possibility began taking shape. At first, it seemed difficult to accept, but the evidence kept pointing toward it. Perhaps July wasn't merely an enslaved man living on the Richborg plantation. Perhaps he was biologically related to the Richborg family itself. For anyone familiar with American slavery, the implications were immediately clear. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, countless children were born to enslaved women and white plantation owners. Many of those relationships existed within a system defined by inequality and absolute power. The children often carried no official acknowledgement of their biological fathers, their identities were left undocumented, their stories frequently disappeared into silence. Could July have been one of those children? The possibility was impossible to ignore, but Thomas needed more than a theory. He needed proof, so he took the next step. Rather than relying on a standard ancestry test, he underwent a far more advanced form of genetic analysis, known as the Big Y700 test. This specialized test examines hundreds of thousands of locations on the Y chromosome. Its purpose is simple: to identify extremely precise paternal relationships that ordinary DNA tests might miss. The process required patience. Genetic genealogy often moves slowly. Researchers must compare data, evaluate matches, and eliminate alternative explanations before drawing conclusions. Eventually, the results arrived, and they were far more definitive than anyone expected. The advanced testing revealed that Thomas and the Richborg descendant shared an extremely rare genetic marker, a marker so specific that both men could be traced back to the same paternal ancestor within a relatively recent historical time frame, not thousands of years ago, not in some distant prehistoric era, but within the period of slavery in the American South. The implications were enormous. The DNA evidence wasn't merely suggesting a connection, it was confirming one. For the first time, science was providing answers that historical records alone could never fully reveal, and those answers pointed toward a conclusion that would completely reshape the Jackson family's understanding of its origins. Because if the DNA was correct, and all evidence suggested it was, then the ancestor known as July was almost certainly connected to the Richburg family, not only through ownership, but through blood. The story the family had believed for generations was about to be rewritten. And the truth, waiting on the other side, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. By the time the advanced DNA results arrived, Thomas Jackson III had already spent years piecing together fragments of the past. He had followed paper trails through plantation inventories, estate records, wills, and family stories passed down across generations. Now, for the first time, modern genetics was beginning to answer questions that historical documents could not, and the answers were leading toward a conclusion that was both powerful and deeply unsettling. The DNA evidence revealed that Thomas Jackson and a descendant of the Richburg family shared an extremely rare paternal genetic marker. This wasn't a connection buried somewhere in ancient history. It pointed to a shared male ancestor who lived during a relatively recent historical period, a period that overlapped directly with slavery in the American South. Suddenly, all the pieces began fitting together. The plantation records, the appearance of July in estate documents, the connection to the Richburg family, and now, the genetic evidence itself. Each clue alone raised questions. Together, they painted a remarkably consistent picture. The most likely explanation was one that generations of descendants had never fully known. July, the ancestor at the center of the Jackson family story, was probably the biological son of James Joel Richburg, the plantation owner who legally controlled the lives of both July and his mother, Rose. It was a discovery that changed everything. For generations, the family had believed their paternal roots connected to Native American ancestry. Now, the evidence suggested a very different reality, a reality rooted not in tribal history, but in the painful truths of slavery itself. This conclusion wasn't based on speculation. It emerged from multiple forms of evidence pointing toward the same answer. Historical records placed July on the Richburg plantation. Family history identified Rose as his mother, and DNA testing revealed a direct paternal connection between descendants of July and descendants of the Richburg family. Taken together, the findings became difficult to ignore. Yet, the discovery carried meaning far beyond genealogy. Because this wasn't simply about identifying an ancestor, it was about understanding the circumstances under which that ancestor lived. Throughout American slavery, countless children were born under conditions defined by extreme inequality and power imbalance. Many never knew their biological fathers. Many fathers never publicly acknowledged them. And in countless cases, official records remained silent. The result was a historical void, a gap where identity should have existed. Families often filled that silence with stories passed down through generations. Sometimes those stories preserved remarkable truths. Other times, they reflected attempts to explain information that had been deliberately hidden or erased. The Jackson family's story appears to have followed a similar path. The belief in Native American ancestry may not have emerged as a deliberate invention. Instead, it may have developed as families tried to make sense of a missing chapter in their own history, without records, without confirmation, without access to the truth. The mystery remained unresolved until science finally provided answers. For many descendants of enslaved families, discoveries like this create complicated emotions. There is sadness, sometimes anger, sometimes grief. Learning that an ancestor's parentage emerged from a system built on ownership and control can be deeply painful, but there can also be something else. Clarity. For the first time, a question that remained unanswered for generations receives an explanation. The unknown becomes known. The silence is replaced by evidence. And a forgotten ancestor becomes a real human being and rather than simply a name buried in old documents. That may be the most important aspect of this story. Because the discovery wasn't really about James Joel Richburg, it wasn't about a plantation owner, and it certainly wasn't about creating scandal. At its heart, this story was about restoring identity, about recovering the life of a man named July, a man whose existence had been reduced to property records, a man whose story was nearly erased by history, a man who lived, worked, loved, and raised a family despite existing within one of the most oppressive systems ever created. Because once researchers looked beyond the legal documents, a different picture emerged. July was not merely a name on an inventory list. He was remembered as a healer, a respected figure within his community, a man who passed knowledge and resilience to the next generation. His son Israel carried that legacy forward. And through Israel, the family line continued generation after generation until eventually it reached Joe Jackson, then Michael Jackson. And suddenly, the story became much larger than one family. It became part of a broader American story, a story shared by countless families whose roots disappear into the era of slavery, families who spend generations searching for names, faces, and connections hidden behind centuries of silence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this discovery was still to come, because the DNA evidence didn't simply reveal who July's father may have been. It also uncovered something entirely unexpected about the Jackson family's deeper origins, something that stretched beyond South Carolina, beyond slavery, and even beyond America itself. The next stage of the investigation would carry the family story across the Atlantic Ocean. And what researchers discovered there would add yet another surprising chapter to a family history already being rewritten. By now, the evidence had already transformed the Jackson family's understanding of its past. The long-held belief in Native American ancestry connected to the ancestor known as July was being challenged by both historical records and genetic science. But the story wasn't over. In fact, researchers were about to uncover another layer of the mystery. And this discovery would take the family history far beyond the plantations of South Carolina. It would eventually lead across the Atlantic Ocean to France. One of the most powerful aspects of modern genetic genealogy is its ability to trace paternal lineages through highly specific DNA markers. These markers function like breadcrumbs scattered across centuries. Each generation inherits them from the one before. And when scientists compare those markers across thousands of individuals, they can often identify the geographic origins of a family line. After Thomas Jackson completed advanced Y-DNA testing, researchers focused on a particular genetic signature found within his results. The marker belonged to a highly specific paternal branch associated with European ancestry. More importantly, it showed a strong connection to families of French origin. That finding immediately attracted attention because the Richebourg family itself traced its roots to French Huguenots. The Huguenots were French Protestants who faced severe religious persecution during the 16th and 17th centuries. Many fled France in search of safety. Some eventually settled in North America, where their descendants established communities throughout the American South. Over time, Stein and several Huguenot families became successful landowners, among them the Richebourgs. Suddenly, the genetic evidence aligned perfectly with the historical record. The DNA didn't merely connect the Jackson family to the Richebourgs. It pointed toward the Richebourgs' European origins as well. In practical terms, this meant something remarkable. The same genetic line that passed through James Joel Richebourg appears to have continued through July, then through Israel, then through generations of descendants who would eventually become the Jackson family. A bloodline that began centuries earlier in France may have quietly continued all the way to one of the most famous entertainers in human history. For many people, this revelation came as a complete surprise. After all, the Jackson family story had never centered around French ancestry. The focus had always been elsewhere, yet the DNA evidence suggested that a significant portion of the family's direct paternal line could be traced back to European settlers rather than the origins previously believed. Still, genealogy is rarely as simple as replacing one story with another. Family trees are complex. Each generation doubles the number of ancestors behind it. By the time researchers travel back several centuries, a single person may have hundreds or even thousands of ancestral connections. The discovery regarding July's paternal line did not erase every possibility of Native American ancestry elsewhere in the family tree. Researchers were careful to emphasize this point. While the direct male line appeared linked to the Richebourg family, other branches remained separate. Many descendants believe Native American ancestry may still exist through maternal lines or other ancestral connections. In genealogy, one discovery rarely explains everything. Instead, it adds another piece to a much larger puzzle. And for the Jackson family, that puzzle was becoming increasingly detailed. Yet beyond the scientific findings, there was also a deeply emotional dimension to the story, because every DNA result represents real people, real lives, real experiences. Learning that an ancestor's origins differ from what generations believed can be complicated. Sometimes it creates excitement, sometimes confusion, and sometimes grief, especially when the truth is connected to systems of oppression and exploitation. The evidence suggested that July's father may have been the very man who legally owned him and his mother. That reality carries a weight that extends far beyond genealogy charts and laboratory reports. It reminds us that family history is often shaped by forces much larger than any individual: war, migration, poverty, discrimination, and in this case, slavery. For descendants, understanding that history can be painful, but it can also be empowering because every new discovery restores part of a story that was nearly lost for generations. July existed only as a distant figure remembered through fragments of oral history. Now researchers were beginning to see him more clearly, not as property, not as a name in a legal document, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose descendants would eventually influence global culture in ways nobody could have imagined. And perhaps that is what makes this discovery so extraordinary. The DNA evidence did not uncover scandal, it uncovered humanity. It restored connections that history had tried to erase. And it demonstrated how modern science can help families reclaim stories that once seemed impossible to recover. Yet as researchers continued exploring the Jackson family tree, another remarkable figure began emerging from the historical record. A man whose life bridged the gap between slavery and freedom. A man whose determination helped shape generations of descendants. A man whose legacy may still be visible in the ambition and resilience that later defined the Jackson family itself. His name was Israel, though many knew him by another name, Nero. And his story would become one of the most inspiring chapters in the entire family history. While the DNA evidence helped solve a centuries-old mystery, it also directed attention toward another extraordinary figure in the Jackson family story, a man whose life represented survival, determination, and resilience against overwhelming odds. His name was Israel, but history remembers him more commonly by another name, Nero. If July's story represents the hidden origins of the family line, then Nero's story represents its rebirth. Born during one of the most difficult periods in American history, Nero entered a world where freedom was still denied to millions of African Americans. His opportunities were limited from the moment he was born. His future was largely controlled by forces beyond his own choosing. Yet somehow, despite every obstacle placed before him, Nero managed to build something remarkable, and in doing so, he helped create the foundation for generations that followed. Family accounts describe Nero as a strong-willed and determined individual. According to stories passed down through descendants, he possessed a fierce sense of independence, a quality that often placed him at odds with those who sought to control him. Some accounts suggest that his resistance and unwillingness to submit quietly may have contributed to his transfer to another plantation during his lifetime. Whether every detail can be historically verified or not, family memory paints a consistent picture. Nero was not a man easily broken, and that spirit would become a defining characteristic of future generations, like his father July. Nero was associated with healing traditions and community knowledge. In an era when professional medical care was often unavailable to African Americans, especially in rural communities, individuals with herbal knowledge and healing skills played an important role. They became trusted figures, problem solvers, caretakers, people others turned to during times of need. These skills were often passed from generation to generation, not through formal schools, but through observation, experience, and oral tradition. In many ways, they represented another form of survival, a way of preserving knowledge despite a society that frequently denied access to education and opportunity. Then came one of the most significant turning points in American history, the Civil War, and eventually, emancipation. For formerly enslaved people, freedom created possibilities that had never existed before. But freedom alone did not guarantee success. Millions still faced poverty, discrimination, violence, and economic hardship. The transition from slavery to independence was far more difficult than many people today realize. Yet Nero refused to remain defined by the circumstances of his birth. Instead, he pursued something that represented both independence and security: land ownership. For African Americans during the late 19th century, owning land was more than a financial achievement. It was a declaration of freedom, a statement that one's future would no longer be controlled by someone else. Records and family histories suggest that Nero eventually acquired multiple parcels of land in Mississippi. For a man born into slavery, this was an extraordinary accomplishment. Every acre represented persistence. Every purchase represented progress. Every success represented victory over a system designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Nero became known as a hardworking and resourceful individual, someone willing to do whatever was necessary to provide for his family and build a better future. Those qualities would become deeply embedded within the family culture. Generations later, many observers would notice similar traits in another Jackson family patriarch, Joe Jackson. Like Nero, Joe possessed an intense drive to improve the lives of his family. Like Nero, he refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstance, and like Nero, he believed success required discipline, sacrifice, and relentless effort. Of course, history remembers Joe Jackson as a complex figure. His methods remain controversial, his parenting style has been debated for decades, but few people question his determination. The same determination that transformed a working-class family from Gary, Indiana, into one of the most successful entertainment dynasties in history. When viewed through the lens of family history, those characteristics begin to feel less surprising, because resilience often travels through generations, not genetically, but culturally. Parents teach children, children teach grandchildren. Values survive long after individuals are gone, and in many ways, Nero's influence appears to have survived through the generations that followed him. Yet his story was not without hardship. As he grew older, illness reportedly made it increasingly difficult for him to manage his land and maintain his livelihood. Financial pressures mounted. Eventually, according to family accounts, debt became a serious problem. The result was devastating. Property that Nero had spent years working to acquire was ultimately lost. Land ownership had represented freedom. Losing it felt like watching part of that freedom disappear. Sadly, stories like this were common throughout the post-Civil War South. Many African American landowners faced discriminatory lending practices, legal manipulation, and economic systems designed to keep wealth concentrated elsewhere. For countless families, building prosperity proved difficult. Keeping it proved even harder. Yet even though Nero lost much of what he had worked to build, his legacy survived. Not through property, not through wealth, but through family. His descendants carried forward the lessons he left behind: persistence, adaptability, determination, hope. And as the generations continued, those qualities would eventually help produce one of the most famous families on earth, the Jacksons. But before the world knew the name Jackson, the family still had one more generation to pass through, one more chapter.